Officer Hadley didn't look twice at the black man behind the wheel. Calm, composed, no panic, no fear. He claimed the car had swerved, demanded the driver step out, and called in backup with a K9 unit. Minutes later, he announced that the dog had alerted for narcotics. When the man challenged the claim, the leash went slack and the dog attacked. What Hadley didn't know, what he never thought to question, was that Marcus had trained dogs like his for war, airports, and federal agencies. The blood on the pavement was real, but so was the reckoning that would follow. Before we go any further, comment where in the world you are watching from and make sure to subscribe, because tomorrow's story is one you don't want to miss. The late August sky over Mississippi had begun its slow collapse into night, the kind of evening where the horizon stretched wide and gold before melting into a deep violet haze. The trees lining Highway 61 were still dense with summer, their thick branches leaning over the road like spectators too tired to cheer. A few distant bugs carried on with their rhythmic hum in the underbrush, and the air held that familiar mix of heat, pine sap, and scorched asphalt, suffocating but honest. Marcus Dean drove northbound, with the window rolled halfway down, and one elbow resting comfortably against the inside of the door, his fingers tapping the wheel in time with the music playing low from the dashboard. There was no rush in his posture. The tires rolled smooth beneath him, and the shadows drawn by the setting sun danced across the hood of the truck like slow water. His Tacoma was well worn but clean, still bearing the marks of long weeks and longer miles. Dog crates in the back, hair on the upholstery, old rubber mats curling at the edges. The silence inside the cabin wasn't uncomfortable. It felt earned. Traffic had thinned out to a trickle in both directions. It was that in-between hour, after the end of most workdays and before the nightlife crowd stirred. The stretch of road ahead was unbroken, the yellow lines bright and undisturbed. He adjusted the volume down with a light touch of the dial, not because anything had changed, but because instinct told him to. Dusk did that, made everything feel thinner, more exposed, like the light was trying to hide before something else arrived in its place. Behind him, headlights appeared. He glanced once in the mirror, casually at first, noting the silhouette of a patrol cruiser cresting the gentle rise about 100 yards back. No siren, no rush, just presence. He looked back to the road, maintaining speed, his grip loosening just slightly on the wheel. The cruiser didn't pass. Instead, it settled into his rear view like it had been there all along, following at a measured distance, not tailgating, but not falling back either. Just pacing. The feeling arrived in his gut like a quiet warning, one he had long since learned not to ignore. He didn't tense, didn't adjust his speed, didn't touch his phone or glance over his shoulder. He simply stayed steady in the lane, signaled a change to the right as the exit for Tallwater passed by, and continued on. Then the lights came on, red and blue, sharp and sudden, cutting across the tree line and throwing color over the inside of the cab in pulsing strokes. The siren didn't wail, just one short burst, like punctuation, at the end of a sentence no one else heard. Marcus signaled and pulled off onto the shoulder, his tires rolling gently over the gravel as he eased the truck to a stop. He cut the engine, rolled the window the rest of the way down, and retrieved his license and registration from the center console, placing both on the dashboard in plain view. Then he set his hands on the wheel. Calm, deliberate, practiced. He didn't move. He didn't reach for anything else. He didn't speak. The cruiser idled behind him with its lights still spinning. When the driver's door finally opened, the officer emerged with the slow, confident stride of someone who had grown too comfortable with their uniform. White, built thick through the chest and neck, late 40s maybe, with the kind of face that seemed made for suspicion. He walked with the posture of a man who expected to be feared or challenged, and didn't care which. When he arrived at the window, he didn't greet Marcus, didn't offer a smile, didn't ask how the night was going. Instead, he leaned slightly toward the open space and said, without preamble, "You know why I pulled you over?" Marcus turned his head slowly to meet the man's eyes. "No, officer," he said, in a tone neither passive nor aggressive, just steady. "You were swerving," the officer replied, his voice flat and authoritative. "Couple miles back, drifting over the center line." Marcus kept his face neutral. "I've been maintaining the lane since I got on this stretch. There was no one around me, no curves, no conditions to cause a drift. I call it like I see it," the officer said, one eyebrow raised. "You calling me a liar?" "I'm telling you I didn't swerve," Marcus said. The officer smirked. "That what they teach you? Talk back and see what happens?" "I answered your question," Marcus replied. "I didn't swerve. If there's something else you want to address, I'm here." "Oh, you're here all right," the officer said, standing up straighter. "Got yourself all cleaned up, driving this thing like you're some kind of professional. But I know what I'm looking at." Marcus didn't respond. Not because he had nothing to say, but because nothing he could say would matter. "You been drinking tonight?" the officer asked next, cocking his head to the side in a show of mock curiosity, sniffing at the air through the open window as if trying to justify the question. "Little something to take the edge off? Whiskey, maybe? Hennessy?" "No," Marcus replied, his voice even and calm, measured with the kind of patience worn thin by long practice. "I haven't been drinking." The officer didn't move away. He leaned closer, his shadow folding into the cab of the truck, his eyes scanning Marcus's face like he was searching for a twitch, a tremble, anything that could be shaped into suspicion. "That's so," he said, the words slow and deliberate, dripping with disbelief. "Because I can smell something, and I've been doing this job long enough to know when a man's trying to talk slick to hide what he's really on." "What you're smelling is dog," Marcus said, his tone unchanged. "I've been around animals all day. That's what's in the air. Not alcohol." "You sure it's not masking something?" the officer asked, tapping the flashlight against the edge of the doorframe now, as though the steady rhythm of plastic on metal might help him think clearer. "You got any weed on you? Pills? Some kind of little helper in the glove box?" "There's nothing illegal in this vehicle," Marcus said, still not raising his voice, still not giving in to the invitation to match the officer's energy. "I haven't used anything. I haven't had anything. There's nothing to find." "You always this smug when you get pulled over?" the officer asked, his lip curling slightly. "You always play the victim? Because you're giving me attitude for a man who says he's clean." "I've done everything you've asked," Marcus answered, his voice low and steady. "Without resistance, without argument, and without aggression. If you're feeling attitude, that might be coming from somewhere else." The silence that followed cracked in the air like heat before lightning. The officer straightened just slightly, then gave a short, bitter laugh under his breath, the kind that came from somewhere deeper than this moment. "You think you're clever," he said. "Got that educated tone, all quiet and smooth, like you're too good to be nervous. Like maybe you think you're better than me." "I don't think anything about you," Marcus said, watching the officer's posture now, not in fear, but in calculation. "Yeah, you do," the man shot back. "You people always do." Marcus didn't answer that. There wasn't a point. Nothing in that response was about curiosity. It wasn't about driving or suspicion or even safety. It was about control, about dominance, about pressing until something cracked. "Step out of the vehicle," the officer said, his voice now clipped and sharp, no longer pretending at routine. "Let's have a look around." Marcus hesitated, not out of fear, but to make sure his hands were still clearly visible on the steering wheel before speaking again. "What is your probable cause for a search? You're sweating. You smell like chemicals and fur. You've got a cage in the back seat. You're twitchy. Your pupils are dilated. It's 84 degrees, Marcus said. The cage is for transporting dogs, and my pupils look the same as they did when you walked up. You want to play hardball? Fine, the officer muttered, stepping away from the door and circling around the vehicle. You think this is the first time I've had someone lie straight to my face? I haven't lied to you, Marcus said, still calm, still seated, still tracking the man's every movement with his eyes, but not with his head. You keep telling yourself that, the officer said over his shoulder, walking toward the rear of the truck. He paused briefly at the tailgate, shone the flashlight into the bed, then continued around toward the passenger side. The gravel under his boots crunched in slow, purposeful rhythm, each step echoing the shift in atmosphere, cool professionalism giving way to something colder. When he returned to the driver's side, he didn't lean into the window this time. He spoke into the radio on his shoulder instead, pressing the transmit button like he'd been waiting for an excuse. Unit 2-3, I need backup on my stop. Solo male, non-compliant. Vehicle shows animal residue and possible concealment. Request K9 support. Repeat, requesting K9. Marcus sat perfectly still, listening to the hiss of the dispatch channel before the response came back with casual efficiency. Copy that, 2-3. Backup en route. K9, ETA 3 minutes. There was no discussion. No second questions. No chance to respond. The officer looked back toward Marcus with a grin that had nothing to do with politeness. Now we're getting somewhere. Within minutes, another cruiser pulled up, lights already flashing as it parked at an angle behind the first. The new arrival, another white officer, younger, leaner, arms crossed, stepped out and took position by the front bumper of the lead vehicle, saying nothing but watching everything. Then came the black SUV, sleek and squared, with K9 unit in bold white lettering across the rear hatch. The vehicle idled for a moment before the rear door opened, and out stepped a broad-shouldered man in his late 50s with a chest like a battering ram and a beard clipped down to a knife's edge. The leash in his hand led to a German shepherd, dark-coated and coiled tight with tension, its eyes sweeping across the scene before focusing on the truck. Sergeant Mercer didn't speak to Marcus. He didn't even look at him. He exchanged a glance with Hadley, then nodded once, signaling that he was ready. "The dog's gonna do a sniff," Hadley said, almost lazily now, as if he had already mentally logged this interaction as a win. "If he alerts, we go in." "I don't consent to a search," Marcus said, stepping out of the vehicle as ordered, moving slow, steady, controlled. He didn't make a show of it, didn't posture. He just stood with the kind of presence that didn't have to announce itself. "I've told you everything truthfully. There are no drugs in that truck, and I haven't used anything." "You don't have to," Hadley said, waving a hand toward Mercer and the dog. "The dog will tell us what's up." Mercer began moving the dog, leading him along the perimeter of the truck with clinical smoothness. The shepherd sniffed low across the front bumper, the door seams, the edges of the wheel wells. Its tail swayed once, neutral. Ears perked, but not locked. Marcus watched carefully. Not the dog, but the handler. The way Mercer shifted the leash slightly near the rear door. The subtle tension in his wrist. The half-click of his tongue when the dog hesitated near the driver's side. And then it came. The dog barked. Once. Loud. Then again, sharper. Mercer gave another gentle tug, a signal that would look benign to the untrained eye. "He's alerting," he announced, with the same hollow confidence as someone reading a script. Marcus didn't move. "That's not an alert," he said quietly, not backing down, not panicked, just factual, clear. "He's reacting to you. There's no physical cue from the dog, no tail stiffening, no ear pivot, no focal fixation. He's responding to your command, not assent. "Excuse me?" Mercer asked, his tone mocking now, as if offended by the idea of being questioned. Hadley stepped forward, posture suddenly more aggressive. "What exactly are you saying?" "I'm saying he didn't alert on his own," Marcus replied. "You prompted him. That's not how detection works." "Oh, we've got ourselves an expert now," Hadley said, his voice rising, his body getting closer. "You want to accuse a certified K-9 handler of faking a drug alert?" "I'm not accusing anyone," Marcus said. "I'm telling you, there are no drugs in that vehicle, and what just happened wasn't a spontaneous indication. It was a forced reaction." "You want to keep running that mouth?" Hadley snapped. "Because I've got zero problem dragging you down to the station and letting you explain your attitude to a holding cell." "I haven't raised my voice. I haven't resisted," Marcus replied, standing perfectly still. "I've complied with every instruction. I've answered every question." Hadley's face twisted into something darker, something unmasked. "You think that tone makes you untouchable? You think standing there like some smooth-talking uppity—" "I think your ego's bruised because I won't shrink." That was it. Hadley stepped back and jerked his chin toward Mercer. "Send the dog in." "Wait," Marcus said, voice firm. "There's nothing to find." "He's already alerting," Mercer responded, snapping the leash once. "He's locked in. We've got justification." "No, you don't," Marcus said. "That's not a real alert, and you know it." "You don't tell me what I know," Hadley barked, suddenly inches from Marcus, the smell of heat and sweat and rage pressing against the air. "You want to play the smart guy? Let's see how smart you sound when you're bleeding." Mercer gave the command in tight, low German. The shepherd's body changed instantly. Its muscles tightened, tail lifted. It sprang forward like a coil released. Marcus didn't flinch, but the moment of calm was torn apart as the dog's jaws clamped down into the meat of his leg, teeth sinking through denim and flesh with machine precision. The weight of the animal took him down fast, driving him into the gravel shoulder with a sickening crack of bone and stone. The pain wasn't sharp at first. It was blunt, immediate, consuming. A pressure that built from within as blood flooded his pants leg and soaked the ground beneath him. He gritted his teeth, jaw locked tight, refusing to scream, not because he wasn't in agony, but because he wouldn't give them that satisfaction. The dog yanked, dragging him an inch, then another, tearing deeper, shaking its head in the way predators do to finish a kill. Marcus's fingers clawed at the ground, his nails catching on stones and shards of old glass, anything to ground himself in the moment. "Get the dog off him!" someone yelled from the road, female, outraged. Hadley didn't move. Mercer stood over them both, arms crossed, eyes unreadable. "I'm filming this," the voice came again. "This is Cara Vasquez, Channel 9. I'm filming everything." A horn blared. Another car stopped. More shouts, more movement. Phones raised, red lights flickered across half a dozen windshields. Still, no one moved. The shepherd barked again, still latched to Marcus's leg, its muzzle now stained a bright gleaming red. Finally, Hadley muttered, "That's enough," and Mercer gave a sharp release command. The dog let go. Marcus lay gasping on the ground, blood pooling beneath him, vision spinning as the faces above him blurred and reformed under the strobe of squad lights. He could taste copper in the back of his throat. His entire leg throbbed in time with his pulse, like it was trying to tear itself free from his body. But his mind stayed clear. His eyes locked on Mercer, who looked down not with remorse, not even with concern, but with the smug, silent confidence of a man who believed nothing would happen to him. And still, even through the pain, Marcus understood exactly what had just taken place. They didn't lose control. They used it. The beeping was distant at first, tinny, intermittent, like the echo of a smoke alarm in another room, but eventually it pulled him into full awareness. The ceiling above Marcus was a dull beige, the kind of institutional color that meant no one had taken a personal interest in it for decades. The light was dim but direct, angled from above in that way only hospital fluorescence could be. Harsh when it wasn't needed, and useless when it was. He blinked slowly. Once, twice, and the sharp drag of skin over dry eyes told him how long it had been since his last conscious thought. His leg ached like it had been split open and filled with fire. Beneath the blanket, he could feel the pressure of bandages, tight but not suffocating, layered with a practiced touch that belonged to someone used to stitching people back together after chaos had ripped them apart. His mouth was dry, the taste of gauze and iron and anesthesia sitting thick on his tongue. Every movement came with its own echo of pain, not sharp, not sudden, but deep, like something had burrowed inside him and decided to stay. Somewhere beyond the wall, a monitor pinged steadily. Across the room, muted voices murmured in casual tones, punctuated by the rattle of wheels over tile, and the distant click of an elevator door opening and closing. He wasn't alone, but he wasn't attended either. He was being observed. He turned his head slowly, neck muscles resisting. The motion brought a bloom of heat behind his eyes, not from injury, but from memory. Something darker than pain, something embedded deeper than the bone. A flash of sand, the sting of grit against sunburned skin. A dog barking, not this one, not the shepherd, but a tan Belgian Malinois sprinting across a bombed-out courtyard, teeth bared, handler shouting commands in broken Arabic, gunfire in the distance, a body falling behind them before the echo even faded. He closed his eyes hard, opened them again, and the beige ceiling returned. Not Iraq, not the base, not that courtyard near Basra, the hospital, the real world, except it wasn't real. Not yet. Not until someone said it was. The door opened softly. A man stepped in, tall, well-built, early 40s, skin the color of red clay, shoulders squared by habit more than vanity. His suit looked expensive but worn at the edges, like someone who could afford better but refused to waste money on image. He moved like someone who had once moved differently, less polished, more deadly, but hadn't forgotten the rhythm. J.J. Washington, old friend, former Marine, now an attorney with a downtown office, a growing reputation, and the kind of righteous anger that had gotten more focused with age. He didn't speak at first, just pulled the chair beside the bed a few inches closer, sat down, folded his hands, and let the silence stretch. Marcus turned his head just enough to meet his eyes. "You saw." "Everyone did," J.J. replied, his voice low but firm. "It's already all over social. News sites are replaying it on loop. Cara Vasquez was the first on the scene. She caught the whole thing on her phone, start to finish. Her station ran it before midnight." Marcus nodded, but slowly, like the acknowledgement cost something. "They still trying to justify it?" he asked. J.J. gave a short exhale that wasn't quite a laugh. "Hadley says you were acting erratic. Mercer claims the dog made a hard alert, said it looked textbook. The department's saying the attack was unfortunate, but justified under protocol. Standard copy-paste statement." Marcus closed his eyes again, but this time not from pain. "They always do," he said. "Yeah, well, Kara's already pushing back. She sent a message, said she wants to talk. She's pissed. Not just as a reporter. She's taking this personally." Marcus didn't answer. His mind was elsewhere. He wasn't thinking about the bleeding. Not the pain. Not even the dog. Not directly. He was thinking about the timing of the command. The leash slack. The handler's pacing. The way the dog moved in a straight line and paused where he was made to pause. The false cue. The absence of a real alert posture. JJ watched him closely. "You're not angry." Marcus opened his eyes again. "Not yet." "You will be." Marcus didn't respond. He was reviewing procedures in his head, starting at the beginning. Initial traffic stop. Alleged cause. Probable cause logic chain. Drug detection standards. Supreme Court precedent on K9 deployment windows. Handler language protocols. False alert triggers. Leash pressure. Vocal commands. All of it lined up. Just wrong. "Are they pressing charges?" he asked. "No, not yet. But they're talking about obstruction. Refusal to comply. Passive resistance." "Passive resistance," Marcus repeated, like the phrase itself tasted strange in his mouth. "That's the language," JJ said. "That's what they always fall back on when the camera doesn't lie. But they still want to explain the violence. How long have I been here?" 15 hours. You went under for surgery almost immediately. Clean tear across the quad. Dog got you deep. They said you'll walk again without a limp if you do the rehab. But it's gonna take time. Marcus nodded once. "And the shepherd?" "They took him back to the unit," JJ said. "He's still active." That was the moment something changed behind Marcus's eyes. Not rage, not despair, just clarity. "Get me the video," he said, voice flat. "I already have it," JJ replied. "And Kara's got more." "Good," Marcus said, "because they're not just lying. They're using." JJ raised an eyebrow. "You ready to go public?" Marcus didn't blink. "Not yet." JJ nodded, standing. "You let me know when. The city's gonna bury this if we don't move fast." Marcus looked down at his leg, the shape of the wound barely visible under the layers of gauze and compression. He could still feel the dog's teeth, not the sharpness, not even the tearing, just the control. The grip hadn't been wild. It had been calculated. He remembered the depth of the bite, the pressure of the clamp, the exact moment the dog had locked in and waited for the follow-up signal that never came. There had been no chaos in the movement, no hesitation, no confusion. That wasn't just training. That was his training. Not in theory, not in method, in execution. The thought settled in him like a stone dropped into still water. Not shocking, not abrupt, just heavy and certain. JJ returned later that evening with a tablet and a stack of papers clipped together. News articles, internal reports, screen captures from social media. He dropped them on the tray beside Marcus's bed, pulled a chair close, and sat without ceremony. "You said you wanted to see everything," he said. "Here's the footage from Kara's phone. Clean audio, wide angle. She got the dog's movements, Mercer's posture, Hadley's face. All of it." Marcus didn't immediately reach for it. He was staring at the IV line running into his arm, watching the slow drip of saline into his bloodstream, as if trying to measure how long it would take to wash the memory out. "Play the clip," he said. JJ tapped the screen. The video loaded. The ambient sounds came first. The murmur of traffic, the shuffle of boots on gravel, the bark of the dog. Then came the voices. Hadley, smug and loud. Mercer, curt and unbothered. The words played out exactly as he remembered them. No surprises there. But it wasn't the voices he was listening for. It was the bark. That specific pitch. The way the dog braced before striking. The movement of the left hind leg, always a half-second slower than the others. That was an old injury. A minor tear from early in basic training. A tell he had noticed in a young male shepherd almost 7 years ago at Lackland Air Force Base. The dog had been stubborn, high drive, brilliant, but impulsive. Marcus had spent weeks getting the animal to respond to soft commands, teaching it restraint before drive, control before chaos. The name had been Django. Short, sharp, easy to command under pressure. As the video played, Marcus's expression didn't change, but something behind his eyes did. "Stop," he said, just as the dog launched. JJ paused the video. "What is it?" Marcus reached slowly for the tablet, tapped the screen to rewind 10 seconds, then froze it on a frame of the dog mid-movement. Legs extended, tail stiff, muzzle pulled back to bare its teeth. "I know that dog," he said. JJ leaned in. "From what?" "Training." "From command," Marcus answered. "I trained him." "You mean recently?" "No," Marcus said. "Years ago. He was one of mine during my time with the program. He had issues early on, muscle imbalance, over-aggression in high-drive drills, but never toward humans, never without purpose. I spent 6 months stabilizing his response patterns. I wrote the profile on him. His posture is identical. Even the scar on the rear left flank. That's Django." JJ leaned back, taking that in for a moment. "You sure?" "I don't forget the dogs I've trained. Not when I put that much work into them." JJ's eyes narrowed slightly. "You think Mercer knows that?" "I think Mercer made sure of it." There was a long pause between them, the silence louder than any noise in the room. Marcus reached for the printouts on the tray, flipping through them until he found a departmental staff profile. Sergeant Curtis Mercer, former handler, reassigned twice in 5 years. Received internal complaints for excessive force during traffic stops. Suspended from a federal training program in San Antonio for deviation from approved protocols. Reinstated in a smaller department 2 years later with a clean slate and no public explanation. Marcus stared at the paper like it had just answered a question he hadn't wanted to ask. "I remember him now," he said quietly. "Not by name at first, but the face. He was part of the second wave of handler applicants during my last year at Lackland. He failed out before certification. Too aggressive. He didn't listen to the dogs. He forced outcomes. We flagged him for overcorrection. He washed out. He never should have had access to those dogs again." JJ stood slowly, pacing once across the narrow space between the bed and the wall, then turned back toward Marcus. "How does a guy like that end up leading K9 for a city department?" "They don't check," Marcus said. "Or they don't care. Or they want guys like that," JJ replied. "If the goal isn't restraint, it's control." Marcus nodded slowly, his eyes back on the frozen image of the dog lunging from the paused video. "He took Django after he left the program. Probably reassigned him after retirement. The records are rarely tracked once dogs are cycled out of federal service. They get donated to local departments. Transferred. You can take a good dog and ruin it in 6 weeks with the wrong training." JJ was silent for a long moment. "You realize what this means, right?" he said eventually. "This wasn't just brutality. He used your own methods against you. He took what you built, corrupted it, and weaponized it." Marcus didn't answer at first. He just stared at the screen again, watching the frame as though something more might reveal itself if he looked long enough. Then he said, "He didn't use my methods. He used the silhouette of them. Just enough form to look legitimate, but none of the substance, none of the respect, none of the structure." JJ sat again, this time closer. "So what's the next move?" Marcus didn't hesitate. "I want his training records. Full logs. If he put Django through a recert, it'll be on file. I want to know what he changed. I want to know how deep this goes. You think he's done it before? I think this isn't his first fake alert. And I think Django isn't the only dog who's been twisted." JJ stood again, already reaching for his phone. "I'll put in the request. We'll have to go through a few back channels, but if there's paperwork, we'll find it." As JJ walked out, Marcus laid back against the pillow and stared once again at the beige ceiling. The pain in his leg was constant now, dull but insistent. He ignored it. What Mercer had done wasn't just personal. It was a betrayal of the work, of the trust he'd built with animals who didn't know how to lie. And now, one of them, his own, had been turned into a weapon to tear him apart. The discharge paperwork took less than 30 minutes to sign, but walking out of the hospital felt like crossing through a wall of heat, sound, and scrutiny that didn't exist when he went in. The late-day sun pressed down on his shoulders like something personal, as if it had been waiting to see if he would still stand after everything. His right leg was bound tightly from thigh to knee, his steps stiff, balanced on a cane he hadn't asked for, but knew better than to refuse. JJ walked beside him, phone in hand, already scrolling through a flood of notifications and media pings. The sidewalk buzzed with summer noise, cars humming by, birds nested in parking lot trees, nurses stepping out for cigarettes or breathers. None of it seemed to touch Marcus. His world was a kind of tunnel now, narrow and clear, leading to something inevitable. Kara was waiting near the curb, leaning against the hood of a dark blue sedan, dressed in jeans and a muted gray shirt, her press badge clipped to her pocket. She wasn't filming. She didn't hold her phone. Her arms were crossed, but not in challenge, more like someone trying to stay contained. As soon as she saw him, she pushed off the hood and stepped forward. "I didn't want to bother you while you were recovering," she said, "but I figured you'd reach out eventually." "I'm reaching out now," Marcus said. She glanced at JJ, who gave a small nod. "He's ready," JJ said, "but nothing's off the cuff." Kara's expression didn't change. "Of course." They drove to a small cafe just off the highway, one that Marcus remembered from years back, but hadn't visited in ages. It was quiet, with tall windows, clean wood tables, and an older couple running the counter who didn't stare or whisper when he limped through the door. That was enough. They sat near the back, far from the entrance, and Marcus let the room settle before speaking. "I know the dog," he said. "The one Mercer deployed. His name is Django. I trained him 7 years ago at Lackland. His posture, his timing, even the scar on his left flank. It's him." "No doubt." Kara blinked once. "You trained the dog that mauled you?" "Yes." She didn't speak immediately. When she did, it was quieter. "And Mercer?" "Was a trainee in the same program," Marcus said. "Didn't finish. Got flagged for violating procedure, using aggressive correction, disobeying leash safety, falsifying canine responses in field simulations. He washed out. The last time I saw his name, it was on a failed handler report." JJ slid a folder across the table toward her. Inside were 2 printouts, one from the training center archives showing Django's original placement profile, and the other a scan of Mercer's removal letter from the federal program. Kara scanned both carefully, her eyes flicking back and forth with practiced speed. "I've already confirmed the dog's transfer," JJ added. "Django was reassigned after retirement, entered a donation program 2 years ago. The trail is murky after that, but enough paperwork points toward the local department pulling him in for K9 use." Marcus leaned forward, voice steady. What Mercer did wasn't a bad decision in the heat of the moment. It was the planned misuse of a dog he knew would obey that command with precision. He took my work, corrupted it, and used it to do exactly what he wasn't allowed to do when he failed out of the program. "And Hadley played into it," Kara said, already thinking aloud, her fingers resting on her phone but not typing yet. The entire setup was built to escalate. Manufactured probable cause, false alert, aggression justified through paperwork. "They've done this before," Marcus said. "I don't know how often." But that wasn't improvisation. That was repetition. Kara's voice dropped. "Do you want to go public?" "Yes," Marcus said. "But not all at once. Let them lie first. I want to see how they move when they think they still control the narrative. Kara nodded slowly, the weight of her reputation behind her expression. I'll start with the piece on the alert video. Just what's public. No claims, no accusations, just breakdown, frame by frame. I'll cite the absence of real alert behaviors and leave the door open for expert commentary that doesn't name you. That's fine, Marcus said. Let them talk themselves into a corner. The article dropped 48 hours later. It didn't explode. It ignited. By the end of the day, it had been picked up by 3 major syndicates. Social media latched onto the still frames. The moment Mercer signaled with the leash, the dog's confused posture, the immediate and brutal takedown. A side-by-side comparison of real versus false alerts began circulating among veteran handlers. Experts began commenting anonymously, confirming what Marcus already knew. This wasn't detection. It was staging. The department issued a generic press release the next morning, labeling the incident under review and calling it regrettable but procedurally sound. Mercer was placed on desk duty. Hadley remained on patrol. The mayor declined to comment. The PR machine was moving, but so was Marcus. He didn't do interviews. He didn't post videos. He didn't shout. Instead, he opened a notebook and began writing names. He contacted 4 former colleagues from his training days. 3 of them had gone on to civilian K-9 work. 1 in Denver, 1 in Atlanta, and 1 just across state lines in Arkansas. All of them had worked with dogs who had been transferred through the same federal retirement channel. All of them had seen red flags in the records coming out of Marcus's city. False alerts. Aggression in low-stress environments. Commands issued without cause. And all of it signed off by Mercer. He's reconditioning them, one handler said on a call, taking stable dogs and turning them into weapons. And whoever's signing off on his research is either complicit or not paying attention. Marcus compiled statements. He built a timeline. He gathered redacted case reports where handlers like Mercer had used questionable alerts to initiate arrests that were later dropped. Patterns emerged. Marcus wasn't looking for one mistake. He was building a pattern of behavior, something so deeply embedded it would be impossible to brush off as coincidence or rogue action. By the end of the week, he had a folder an inch thick and a drive with enough footage, transcripts, and affidavits to build a civil rights case before the department could write its next press release. The storm hadn't hit yet, but the winds were changing, and Marcus was already standing in the eye. Later that night, long after the cafe had emptied out and the rain had shifted from a steady drizzle to the soft hiss of wet pavement beneath passing tires, Marcus sat alone at his kitchen table, the old military folder open in front of him. The house was quiet. JJ had gone for the night, promising to follow up on the recertification trail in the morning. Kara had left too, but not before handing him a hard drive filled with archived field footage she thought might help him prove his case. He hadn't opened it yet. Instead, he stared at the folder, at the lines of text, the names, the codes, and the dates. But his mind wasn't in the present. It was back in Iraq. Not in the violence, not at first, but in the strange calm that settled between missions, the kind of stillness that felt like silence, but was always crowded with fear, fatigue, and heat thick enough to weigh down your bones. He saw a younger version of himself, sitting in a corrugated metal operations tent outside Najaf, sand caked in every fold of his uniform, neck still damp with sweat, boots lined with grit so fine it clung even after 4 rinses. The electric hum of generators vibrated through the floor, and the smell of burnt plastic and diesel lived in the air like it had been born there. That's when she had walked in. Kara Vasquez, 26, impossibly young for a war correspondent, but already carrying the expression of someone who had seen things she would never fully describe. She wore body armor that didn't quite fit, and boots that had clearly been broken in the hard way, and her hair was pulled back in a way that said function over form. She had a Nikon camera slung across one shoulder, and a press badge clipped to her flak vest like it was supposed to offer protection from bullets, suspicion, or both. "Where's your unit leader?" she asked, standing just inside the flap of the tent, blinking against the low light. Her tone wasn't rude, but it wasn't deferential either, just tired, focused, and direct. "You're looking at him," Marcus had replied, barely looking up from the field report he was pretending to finish. "I was told I'd be embedded with your patrol until next week," she said, taking another step in, the canvas floor crackling beneath her boots. "I assume someone's going to tell me the rules of engagement before we leave." He looked at her fully then, studied the shape of her stance, the way her fingers rested lightly against the camera strap, but not the equipment itself, the way her eyes didn't wander or flinch even when the crack of distant gunfire echoed faintly beyond the compound wall. "You want to walk with the unit?" he asked. "I don't want to sit in a Humvee while the real story passes me by," she said. "I want to see it. That story might include you getting shot at." "That would be honest," she said. And that was the start. Over the next several days, Kara embedded with his squad on every rotation. She didn't speak unless spoken to. She didn't interrupt the rhythm of movement. But she noticed things. She asked questions that were too sharp for her age, listened in a way that made even the most hardened guys lower their voices and answer fully, and documented everything without voyeurism or dramatics. When another correspondent tried to stage a photo of children in a bombed-out courtyard, Kara snapped at him loud enough to get the captain's attention and then deleted the shot herself. At night, in the brief hours between briefings and movement, she'd sit outside the barracks beside Marcus, both of them drinking gritty instant coffee from plastic mugs and staring into the silence beyond the wire. It was during one of those nights, after a particularly chaotic patrol in which a local informant had been mistakenly detained, that Kara had turned to him and asked the question he'd never forgotten. "Do you ever get used to being right about danger before anyone else sees it?" "No," he'd said after a moment. "But you do learn when to speak and when to wait. And you always wait. Until it matters," he said. Back in the present, Marcus blinked once, and the memory cleared like smoke dissipating. He was still in the kitchen. The folder was still open. But the part of him that had stayed in that memory, the part that still remembered Kara, not as a journalist, but as a comrade, had shifted slightly. He reached for his phone. The line rang twice before she picked up. "I was just about to call you," she said, her voice warm with the kind of exhaustion that didn't dull the clarity behind it. "You remember Najaf?" Marcus asked. A pause. Then, "The dust storm? I was thinking of that night after the informant mix-up." "I remember," she said. "That was the first time I trusted a soldier more than I trusted the people paying me to tell the story." He didn't respond right away. "I never forgot what you said," she added, more quietly now. "About waiting until it matters." Marcus looked at the folder again, at the damage Mercer had done to everything they both used to believe could still be repaired. "It matters now," he said. "Yes," Kara replied. "It does." As they sat on opposite ends of the call, her in a small apartment cluttered with hard drives and field notes, him in a dim kitchen still smelling faintly of iodine and hospital plastic, the distance between them didn't feel like absence. It felt like preparation. They weren't young anymore. They weren't idealists. But something old had started to wake again. Inside her. Inside him. Something that hadn't stirred since Iraq. Not just a cause, not just conviction. A kind of trust, not blind, not reckless, earned. And neither of them would be backing down. The neighborhood had always been quiet after dark, but tonight the stillness didn't feel restful. It felt constructed, artificial, like something had pressed down on the natural rhythm of the streets and silenced it into submission. Even the insects seemed absent. No sirens in the distance. No music bleeding through open windows. No idle arguments or laughter from porches. The silence was too complete, too perfect, and Marcus felt it settle on his shoulders like a weight that didn't belong to him. He moved through the alley behind his house with care, not from fear, but from discipline. The limp in his step hadn't slowed him much, and though he carried the cane, it was more for disguise than support. He didn't trust calm nights. Not when the days leading up to this one had carried the fingerprints of surveillance. The same SUV parked across the street 3 nights in a row, headlights flickering once too often, an unfamiliar drone buzz near his window that didn't sound like neighborhood toys. These weren't amateurs, they were deliberate, and they were escalating. By the time he reached the edge of the lot near the old warehouse, Marcus already knew he wasn't alone. He had sensed it in the weight of the air, in the silence that swallowed his footfalls, in the faintest scratch of gravel under boots that were trying too hard to move like shadows. He didn't turn around, didn't glance over his shoulder or break pace. That would have betrayed awareness, and what they wanted, more than anything, was fear. He could hear the whisper of voices now. Not full words, just tone and rhythm, the same low, controlled cadence used by men who believed they still held the leash of a situation. One of them walked with a soldier's stride, slightly overcorrected, the left foot dragging half a second behind. Mercer. The other moved with less intent, more swagger than discipline. Hadley. They weren't hiding. They were circling. The moment Marcus crossed into the mouth of the narrow path between the storage yard and the loading dock, he heard the distinctive sound of leashes being unbuckled. Metal against metal. Then a low, controlled command in German. Deliberate, careful, rehearsed. What followed wasn't barking. It was pursuit. 2 dogs, full-grown, high drive, trained to move fast and without noise. No hesitation, no testing the air for scent, no checks for command alignment. These were not being sent to search. They had been released to damage. Marcus adjusted course, his stride steady but sharp, directing himself toward the side entrance of the warehouse. He'd scoped the building earlier in the week for precisely this reason, noting the reinforced fencing inside the loading bay and the intact mechanism for the security gates. The city had abandoned the property years ago, but some of its bones remained intact, rusted but functional, enough for what he had in mind. The dogs were closer now. He could hear their paws strike pavement, fast, rhythmic, deadly. Still no barking, just movement. They had been trained for this moment, and he had trained dogs like them long enough to know exactly how close they were. His breathing stayed measured, controlled, and though his leg burned with every step, he kept his body fluid, using the momentum of his forward motion to avoid shifting his weight unnecessarily. At the door, he didn't stop. He pushed it open, entered, and let it swing half-closed behind him. Enough to create noise, but not to give away that he intended to trap them inside. The interior of the warehouse was cavernous and cold, the air damp with mildew and engine grease from a time when machines had once lived here. Broken crates lay scattered across the floor, and old shelving units lined the walls like skeletons. He moved quickly, but not erratically, guiding himself deeper toward the central forklift enclosure, a square ring of fencing that had once secured heavy tools, but now served as a containment pen. The gate still worked. It had been tested. The control box, though rusted, responded when touched. He only needed to get them inside. A sharp growl echoed behind him, not from aggression, but recognition. They had his scent now, and they were moving fast, the scrape of nails against concrete growing louder, more urgent. He didn't stop. He rounded the stack of pallets, stepped into the ring, and whistled once, just enough sound to draw them forward. The first dog entered hard, muscles taut, tail rigid. A massive shepherd, scarred around the ears, its eyes wide with focus. The second dog followed just seconds later, slightly smaller, darker, moving with surgical intent. Marcus stepped aside, staying just outside their initial lunge radius, and reached behind him to throw the lever. The gate clanged shut. The crash echoed through the chamber like a dropped anvil, and immediately the dogs turned back, teeth bared, testing the fencing with bodies that had been built to break. But the gate held. The structure was steel, bolted into concrete, stronger than the handlers had known. And now the dogs were trapped. Not leashed, not restrained by command, contained. Marcus backed away slowly, his breathing still controlled, eyes watching every twitch of their posture. He didn't move with panic, didn't look away. He held their attention with the same calm presence he had used when they were pups in training, when they learned that the hand could command, but never deceive. These dogs weren't wild. They were betrayed. He could hear movement at the main entrance, boots pounding against steel and concrete, faster now, less cautious. Hadley was yelling, his voice rough with frustration, echoing down the corridor. "You think this makes you a hero?" Marcus didn't answer. He didn't need to. The tone said everything. Hadley was no longer performing for cameras or protocol. He was acting purely out of ego now, cornered and furious, his leash finally off. Mercer didn't speak, but the sound of his steps was heavier, faster, more measured, like a man already picturing the outcome in his head and walking directly toward it. Then Hadley came in first, headlong, rage pouring off him like steam off pavement. He didn't move with strategy. He charged. But a charging man can still break bone. His first swing came wide, fueled by speed and sheer mass, knuckles aiming straight for Marcus's throat. Marcus slipped the angle by inches, stepped inside the swing, and drove a punishing elbow upward into Hadley's jawline, the crack of bone against bone as sharp as snapping ice. Hadley staggered back, but didn't fall. His eyes were wild, spit foaming at the edge of his mouth, blood already painting the side of his chin. He recovered fast and came again, lower this time, throwing his shoulder into Marcus's ribs. The impact sent both of them skidding across the concrete floor. Marcus hit first, back colliding with a steel support beam, the reverberation flashing white across his vision. No time to catch breath. Hadley was on him again, swinging, punching, biting with fists that didn't stop, even when they missed. Marcus blocked high, took a hammering blow to his collarbone, felt the joint pop slightly under the force, but turned the pain into motion. He grabbed Hadley by the collar and yanked forward, letting the man's momentum do the work before slamming a brutal knee up into Hadley's gut. The air burst from Hadley's lungs like a vacuum snap, and Marcus spun, pivoted, and drove the heel of his boot into Hadley's thigh. The leg buckled, and Hadley dropped, catching himself with one hand as he reached under his coat with the other. Gun. Marcus didn't wait. He dove, crashing into Hadley just as the muzzle cleared the holster. The weapon skidded across the floor, spinning beneath the rack of broken pallet crates. Hadley clawed toward it, but Marcus grabbed him by the ankle, dragged him back, and slammed a fist into the side of his neck hard enough to shut down movement. But the sound of the second entrance was already behind him. Mercer entered like a ghost, silent, efficient, a predator who had studied this fight while Hadley burned through it. He moved with precision, feet set wide, knees bent slightly, hands open, assessing range before committing. Marcus didn't rise fully. He used his crouch as leverage and launched up fast, throwing a looping right aimed at Mercer's jaw. but Mercer caught the arm mid-air, twisted it, and stepped behind. Marcus turned with him, breaking the lock before it could tighten, but Mercer moved fast and clean. No waste, no anger, just training. They collided, grappling now, elbows and knees grinding against each other's torsos, twisting for leverage, each trying to unbalance the other. Mercer shifted his weight low and drove a knee into Marcus's bad leg. Precise, deliberate. Marcus grunted, teeth gritted, and responded with a short headbutt to Mercer's nose, the sudden crack a splash of red and cartilage. But Mercer didn't flinch. He responded instantly, landing 3 quick jabs to Marcus's ribs, forcing him to retreat toward the shelving racks near the containment cage. Marcus grabbed a metal pipe from the ground, swung wide, missed the head, but caught Mercer in the shoulder. The impact echoed like a muffled bell. Mercer stumbled back, but only for a second. He recovered and tackled Marcus, slamming him into the support pillar, shoulder to chest. They went down hard. Concrete scraped against skin. Marcus rolled first, trying to break clear, but Mercer caught his foot, pulled him backward, and dropped a knee directly onto Marcus's side. The pain flared across his ribs like fire spreading under skin. He twisted, grabbed Mercer's vest strap, pulled him down, and elbowed him across the temple. Once, twice, a third time until Mercer's grip weakened. They broke apart, both heaving now, both bleeding, the warehouse lights overhead flickering slightly from age or fury, or both. The concrete beneath them was smeared with sweat and blood, their shadows stretching like broken limbs across the floor as they circled again, slower this time, the brutal rhythm of exhaustion beginning to outpace fury. Mercer spat crimson onto the ground, one eye nearly swollen shut, his nose twisted and leaking. Marcus's breathing was ragged, his shirt torn at the shoulder, and every breath stung as if the inside of his chest had been lined with knives. Hadley, staggering upright now like something risen out of smoke, grunted like an animal that didn't recognize pain as a limit. His face was split across the cheekbone, one arm limp at the shoulder, but in his other hand he gripped a broken shard of shelving pipe, jagged at the end where it had torn away from the wall. His boots dragged across the floor in a crooked line, steel toe scraping sparks as he limped toward Marcus, eyes wild and mouth twisted into a grin that held nothing but venom. Marcus turned as Hadley rushed. The pipe came down fast and wide, an arc meant to end something, not warn. Marcus ducked, the metal edge whistling just above his skull, and then rose fast from the crouch, slamming a shoulder into Hadley's sternum and driving them both backward into the fencing of the containment pen. The dogs inside barked once, loud and sharp, a reminder of the storm still watching from the cage. Hadley swung again, this time sideways, catching Marcus along the ribs. The pipe didn't slice, but it landed hard enough to send shock through his torso, forcing him to stumble sideways and drop to one knee. Hadley advanced, raising the weapon again. Before it could fall, Marcus surged upward, grabbed the inside of Hadley's elbow, twisted with his full weight, and jammed the joint backward until the tendon screamed beneath the pressure. Hadley howled, dropped the pipe, and tried to claw at Marcus's face. Marcus blocked, shoved the man backward, then pivoted off his good leg and delivered a punishing elbow directly into Hadley's throat. The hit didn't break anything, but it shut the man up. Air escaped in a gasp, and Hadley folded to the floor, wheezing, hands grabbing his own neck in a pathetic, instinctive attempt to regain control of his own breathing. Mercer came in without warning, silent, fast, all intent and zero wasted motion. He used his injured shoulder as bait, swinging low with his good arm, aiming for Marcus's side. Marcus stepped back, let the punch graze his hip, then countered with a sharp hook to the liver. Mercer doubled slightly, and Marcus followed with a knee to the chin, the blow landing clean enough to whip Mercer's head back into the side of the broken shelving unit behind him. But even stunned, Mercer was relentless. He grabbed a loose length of chain from the floor, wrapped it around his wrist in one smooth motion, and lashed out in a tight arc. The chain bit into Marcus's forearm, drawing blood through torn skin. He flinched, then caught Mercer by the shoulder, pulled him forward, and slammed a brutal headbutt into the bridge of the man's nose. Mercer staggered, fell to one knee, and Marcus didn't wait. He used the chain now, looping it behind Mercer's neck and dragging him to the ground with his body weight. Not to choke, not to kill, but to pin, to hold, to end it. Mercer kicked wildly, but the fight was already bleeding out of him. His breathing turned erratic, pulse slowing, resolve breaking. Marcus leaned down, locked his arm tighter, spoke through clenched teeth as blood dripped freely from his own mouth and nose, the words ragged with exhaustion. "This is the last time you put your hands on anyone without consequences." Mercer's body went slack, not unconscious. Defeated. Marcus released him, rolled off, sat back against the wall, and pressed a trembling hand against his ribs. For a long moment, there was only the sound of distant barking, quiet now, almost subdued, and the sharp drip of blood hitting concrete. Hadley lay half-conscious nearby, his breathing hoarse and wet. Mercer was still on the floor, blinking slowly, his mouth opening and closing like a man trying to explain something to himself. Marcus didn't move for several long seconds. Then, finally, with effort, he stood. He limped toward a toolbox that had spilled open during the chaos, pulled a pair of zip ties from its tray, and returned to Hadley first. The officer flailed weakly but didn't resist, as Marcus bound his wrists behind his back. Mercer didn't fight it at all. When both were restrained, Marcus turned toward the containment pen, where the two dogs had gone silent. They stood still, alert, not aggressive, watching with the understanding of animals that had seen the leash drop and not been punished for running. He approached slowly, opened the gate, and let them come to him on their terms. They stepped forward. They sniffed his hands, cautious but not afraid, searching for something familiar in his scent, his stance, the quiet way he stood without threat. Their heads lowered slowly, not in fear, but in recognition, some deep memory of early training, of calm hands and steady voices before the commands turned harsh, and the leash became a weapon. Marcus reached out, placed a hand on each of their shoulders, and spoke the original cues, not the twisted commands they'd been forced to obey, but the ones meant to guide, to ground, to connect. The dogs didn't bark or flinch. They just stood there, still and alert, their bodies softening as if something inside them had finally been allowed to exhale. He stepped back without rush, reached into his coat, and pulled out his phone, the weight of it suddenly heavier now that it held the power to show everything that had happened. With one swipe, he opened the camera and began to record, capturing the ruined warehouse floor, the blood, the two officers lying restrained and beaten, and the dogs once weaponized, now standing quietly beside him. The camera didn't need commentary. The footage would speak for itself. And as the red light blinked in silence, Marcus remained still, upright, bruised but unbroken, knowing full well that the world was about to see what really happened, and who had finally fought back. The warehouse had gone still in the hours after. The concrete had dried with blood in its cracks, the air heavy with the metallic scent of sweat and rust, and the echo of boots, barking, and fists had faded into memory. Marcus had stayed just long enough for the authorities to arrive, for Mercer and Hadley to be taken into custody, restrained, bruised, and sputtering through half-hearted lies that no longer held the weight of authority. He had spoken only when necessary, provided his recording, answered the medic's questions through shallow breaths, and declined a second ambulance ride despite the searing pain in his side. There was something else he needed to do first, something that couldn't wait for healing or headlines or lawyers. The drive to the facility had been quiet, the kind of silence that didn't offer peace, only focus. Marcus had driven alone, replaying every second of the attack in his mind. Not the punches or the pain, but the way the dogs had looked at him before it all began. There had been confusion in their eyes, not rage. Something trained, yes, something sharpened by cruelty, but beneath that was hesitation, a flicker of the bond they once had before everything was twisted by the men who had failed them. He couldn't leave them in cages, not now, not after this. The kennel wing carried the sterile smell of bleach and cold metal, that sharp industrial bite that lingered in the back of the throat, mixed with something more organic, wet fur, old aggression, and the quiet trace of fear, not from the humans working the cages, but from the dogs held behind them. Each enclosure hummed with tension, not the wild, chaotic kind, but the brittle restraint of creatures that had been trained too harshly, too long, to express anything openly anymore. Their bodies were wired tight with the memory of shock collars and shouted commands, muscles taut beneath coats thinned by stress. They didn't bark like most kenneled dogs. They watched, and waiting, for them, had become second nature. Marcus walked the corridor with the same careful, deliberate pace he had used in war zones and compound searches, not because he was afraid, but because he understood deeply what movement meant in the presence of damaged animals. Every step, every breath, every shift of weight told them something. And these dogs, especially Django and Bravo, had been taught to survive by anticipating what came next. He passed the first few cages without pausing, letting each set of eyes adjust to the fact that he wasn't dressed like Mercer or the others, that he didn't carry a prod, didn't hold a leash or a clipboard, and wasn't here to dominate or control. The dogs responded to that slowly, some tilting their heads, others pressing their bodies into the backs of their pens, uncertain but curious in that deep, cautious way dogs study you when they're trying to remember what safety used to feel like. Django was near the end, housed in a wide enclosure with reinforced bars and claw marks etched deep into the steel from months, maybe years, of anxiety left unchecked. He stood at the far wall, facing the entrance, posture tense but not aggressive, his ears drawn back and tail still, not tucked, but low enough to signal uncertainty. His coat was duller than Marcus remembered, and a faint scar ran along his hind leg, the kind that doesn't come from training accidents but from deliberate punishment. Bravo, just across the aisle, paced his pen in tight, repetitive circles, his nails clicking against the concrete in a metronome of frustration, tail held stiff and mouth twitching, as if every loop around the enclosure was another reminder that he hadn't been allowed to rest. A young handler had already learned the price of impatience. Bravo had bitten him during a leashing attempt, not out of fury, but confusion. A reaction formed when commands are inconsistent, and pain is handed out more frequently than praise. Marcus didn't speak as he approached. Words meant nothing if tone betrayed them, and too many of these dogs had been taught to flinch at kindness because it always came before correction. Instead, he lowered himself to a crouch in front of Django's gate and rested his hands on his knees, palms open, facing up, a posture of offering, not control. The silence stretched long, thick with uncertainty and memory. Django didn't approach at first, but he didn't growl either. His eyes narrowed, his nose lifted slightly, and he inhaled. Once, twice, then deeper, as if memory was something that could be drawn from scent alone. When Marcus finally spoke, The voice was so soft, it barely carried beyond the bars. "Django! Sits!" The word was quiet, wrapped not in command but in history. Django didn't react right away, but his ears twitched, his weight shifted, and after several long seconds, he sat. Not a formal, sharp response, but a slow, thoughtful act, as if the body remembered before the mind caught up. Marcus nodded once and slowly opened the gate. Not fast, not loud. He stepped inside without hesitation and knelt again, repeating the next cues in a cadence that Django had once responded to instinctively. This time, the dog moved forward, not lunging, not wary, just moving, his body rigid with mistrust, but his steps anchored in something older, something stronger than fear. When Django pressed his head into Marcus's chest, it wasn't obedience, it was recognition. Bravo took longer. He was more broken, less trusting, a dog who had survived more than he had been shaped. Marcus crossed to his cage, watched as the pacing stopped, and held his ground as the growling began. Not deep enough to be a threat, but loud enough to say, "Not yet." Still, Marcus spoke the same words, one at a time, evenly, with no challenge in his tone, and waited. When he opened the gate, Bravo didn't charge. He circled once, then twice, then stood facing Marcus with his body angled, ears flat, tail still as steel. Another word, another breath, and then, finally, Bravo lay down. Not because he was told, but because he remembered how to listen again. The other handlers were frozen in place behind the safety line, their expressions caught somewhere between disbelief and unease, their hands twitching toward radios they hadn't thought to raise. Marcus didn't look at them. He didn't need to. He knew what they were seeing now, and he knew how much easier it had been for them to believe that aggression lived in the dogs rather than in the methods used to shape them. "This is what happens," Marcus said at last, his voice low, his hands still resting gently on Bravo's shoulders. "When you take loyalty and replace it with fear. When you break a creature over and over again until it's not sure who it's supposed to trust. And then you call it dangerous because it learns to survive the only way it can." He stood slowly, not letting go until the dog moved with him. Not in sync, but in solidarity. Django stood as well, flanking Marcus on the other side. "They didn't choose this," Marcus added, eyes now locked on the supervisor behind the glass. "They were trained into it. And if you keep using men like Mercer to write the rules, then every dog that comes through this building is going to end up just like them, lost, violent, and convinced that every hand reaching for them is about to hurt." No one responded. The silence didn't need to be filled. He had made the point the only way anyone ever listens in places like this. Not by lecturing, but by proving. And somewhere, in the stillness of that broken facility, surrounded by cages that once housed weapons but now held memory, something shifted. Not enough to fix it, but enough to start. The shift began quietly. First in whispers, then in headlines, and finally in a courtroom that felt too small for what it had come to represent. What started as grainy footage filmed under warehouse lights became a national broadcast, dissected frame by frame across networks and social media feeds, with captions that no longer gave the benefit of the doubt to the uniform. Marcus's video wasn't just evidence, it was indictment, confession, and prophecy wrapped in one continuous shot. And when the trial date was announced, it wasn't just another proceeding. It was a spectacle, a reckoning years in the making. Inside the courthouse, cameras were banned, but the pressure was no less present. Reporters waited outside the steps each morning, their breath fogging against early autumn chill, pressing microphones forward as though proximity could grant access to the truth. JJ entered each day with her head high and notes tightly organized, her suit pressed, her eyes sharp. Kara walked in just behind, not as a witness yet, but as someone whose presence signaled that silence was no longer acceptable. Her articles had stripped the case raw, exposing not only the violence against Marcus, but the department's long pattern of misconduct. Doctored canine training logs, altered deployment reports, use of force records buried behind administrative jargon, each one now a loose thread JJ pulled in court, one by one, until the entire tapestry started to unravel. The courtroom itself was a study in contrast. Hadley and Mercer seated at the defense table in tailored suits that couldn't quite hide the weight loss, the tension, or the bruises not yet faded from Marcus's fists. Neither man made eye contact with him as he entered, and when they whispered to their attorneys, it was with the twitchy restraint of men who had long been used to being feared, now forced to explain themselves. When Kara finally took the stand, the room shifted again, not because of theatrics, but because of clarity. Her testimony wasn't emotional, but it was devastating in its precision. She laid out what she saw on the roadside. The moment Marcus tried to speak calmly and was ignored. The way Mercer gave a barely visible leash flick, a signal trained handlers would recognize as deliberate cueing, not a reaction to a real alert. She spoke of the crowd that began to gather, the cell phones raised in shaky hands, the moment the dog lunged and Marcus screamed. She didn't cry. She didn't dramatize. She gave the jury the moment as it happened, clean and without exaggeration. JJ followed it by walking the courtroom through the footage again, this time on a large monitor, pointing not to what was obvious, but what had been missed until Marcus explained it to her. The unnatural tension in the leash, the specific position of Mercer's hand just before the so-called alert, the body language of the dog, uncertain, confused, ears low. Then she brought in the records, falsified logs with identical timestamps, performance reports with entire sections copied and pasted between different dogs, evaluations signed by supervisors who were no longer with the unit. Every page was another splinter driven deeper beneath the department's skin. When it came time to cross-examine Hadley, JJ didn't rush. She let him settle, let him puff up slightly in the witness box, his posture rigid with rehearsed confidence. She asked simple questions first: date of the stop, his stated cause, the sequence of radio calls. He answered in clipped professional tones, clearly trying to reassert control over a narrative that had long since broken from his grip. But JJ was deliberate. She slowly introduced inconsistencies, each one small but cumulative. Why the initial report said Marcus had slurred speech when the body cam audio was clear. Why the dash cam had a gap during the critical moment when Mercer issued the alert. And why a K9 unit that was supposedly assigned elsewhere had arrived within 2 minutes of the traffic stop being initiated. Hadley bristled. The courtroom held its breath. When she brought up Lena Brooks, former supervisor of the K9 division, recently subpoenaed, Hadley's shoulders stiffened. JJ introduced her calmly, without fanfare, letting the jury see that the department's own former leadership had turned on its rank and file. Lena's testimony, though brief, was surgical. She confirmed Mercer had been expelled from Marcus's original program for manipulating alerts and using unauthorized aggression cues. She confirmed Hadley had filed falsified field reports in at least 2 other stops that never led to charges. She confirmed, most importantly, that both officers had operated for years without meaningful oversight, and that her internal warnings had been buried. Then she said the one thing that broke the mask completely. I warned the department that Marcus Wynn's training materials were being twisted. They didn't just ignore me. They encouraged it. The silence that followed was electric. Hadley broke first. He stood suddenly, slamming his open palm against the edge of the witness stand as if volume could unmake what had just been said. The judge barked for order, bailiffs moved quickly, and Hadley, red-faced and stammering, began to shout something about lies, about conspiracy, about people not understanding what it was like out there, his words unraveling faster than he could control them. Mercer stayed seated, face drawn tight, jaw locked, a man watching his house burn down one floor at a time. The judge struck the outburst from the record, but didn't forget it. When J.J. requested bail be denied due to instability and threat of witness intimidation, the judge didn't hesitate. Request granted. Officers Mercer and Hadley will be remanded to county custody until sentencing. The gavel hit wood like a final heartbeat. And with that, the courtroom emptied, one side silent in defeat, the other silent in awe, as Marcus stood slowly from the gallery. Not triumphant, not vindictive, just tired, but finally seen. The trial may have locked Hadley and Mercer behind bars, but Marcus knew the story didn't end with them. What they did wasn't rogue behavior. It was too systematic, too clean, too well-practiced to have grown in the dark without permission. Somewhere behind the uniforms, beyond the courtroom testimony and clipped denials, there was an infrastructure. It was the kind that didn't leave fingerprints in obvious places, but if you knew where to look, and more importantly, how to look, the pattern began to reveal itself. It started with a file. J.J. had forwarded it to Marcus after receiving it anonymously. PDFs stripped of metadata, exported without headers, just page after page of training logs that didn't match official department records. They were handwritten in places, redacted sloppily in others, but the dates aligned with deployments Marcus had already flagged. Some of the dog names were familiar, ones he'd trained years ago and never heard from again, supposedly retired into peaceful homes or turned over to airport K-9 programs. But according to the logs, they had been transferred to private units, a vague term that carried no official designation. Worse still, the logs included cues Marcus had never authorized, aggression drills, chemical stimulus conditioning, even entries marked threshold overrides, a euphemism he recognized instantly as forced desensitization through pain. These weren't mistakes. They were intentional rewrites of everything he'd ever built. He didn't sleep that night. Instead, he drove 6 hours to a facility listed in the margin of one of the documents, a privately operated K-9 training site outside of Gainesville that claimed to specialize in advanced obedience for industrial security clients. On paper, it looked legitimate. Paperwork in order, insurance posted, permits framed neatly on the office walls. But Marcus didn't need paper to read a building. The layout was wrong. The spacing of the kennels was too tight, the dogs too thin, their eyes too flat. No handler spoke unless spoken to, and every command Marcus overheard was barked, not spoken. The way people issue orders when they're afraid of not being obeyed. He waited until shift change to step into the perimeter unchallenged, walked the outer run path until he reached the back row of kennels where the lights were dimmer, the dogs louder, and the clipboard logs thinner than they should have been. He recognized one of the dogs instantly, a Belgian Malinois named Rocket, who had once been trained under his oversight for search and rescue, but had apparently been retired after minor joint injuries. Now, Rocket's eyes followed Marcus with a kind of anxious gratitude, as if memory hadn't died, just gone dormant beneath months of pain and confusion. A scar ran across his flank, where no working dog should have been injured. The moment Marcus crouched and called the old cue, Rocket sat, not sharply, not immediately, but with a tremble of recognition that confirmed everything the paperwork had tried to hide. Marcus filmed everything: cage numbers, ear tags, command responses, facility layout, and, when no one was watching, the training boards posted behind a thin plastic door labeled Instructor Access Only. The terminology was unmistakable: bite, drive, amp, over-commanding for correctional compliance. pain indexing. And worst of all, decommission queue, a line item marked with an expiration date for dogs who failed to adjust. This wasn't just training, it was trafficking. He left with the footage backed up to 2 separate devices and Rocket in the passenger seat, silent, thin, but alert. Head on Marcus's thigh the whole drive back, like the miles between them were being erased with each stretch of open road. Kara met him at the edge of the city. She didn't ask what happened. She didn't need to. The look on his face told her enough, that this had gone beyond revenge, beyond justice, beyond courtrooms and statements. This was systemic. This was protected. And now, with the evidence in hand, it could no longer hide behind the curtain of plausible deniability. Together, they built the case. Kara wrote the article not like a journalist, but like someone reclaiming her name, pulling from first-hand footage, the testimony of former handlers Marcus had trained and reconnected with, the internal memos JJ managed to subpoena after Hadley's bail denial gave the DA broader jurisdiction. The story named names, facilities, contractors, departments. It connected dots between K-9 retirements and private security firms in multiple states, outlined how dogs labeled aggressive were redirected through shadow networks to training farms that rewrote their instincts and sold them to companies with little oversight. Mercer wasn't just a rogue element. He was a recruiter, a gatekeeper, and, in some cases, the one reprogramming the dogs himself using notes he'd stolen from Marcus's original manuals. When the story went live, it hit like a hammer, not just across the state, but nationally. Departments released statements of concern. Officials called for independent investigations. The public, already reeling from the trial footage, now saw that the 2 officers weren't just abusers. They were frontmen for something deeper. And when Marcus released the names of the dogs he recovered, each one trained once to serve and later twisted into fear-based tools, readers didn't just share the post. They demanded action. A state task force was assembled within weeks. Federal agencies requested interviews. Marcus received offers from law enforcement reform committees, from animal welfare organizations, from congressional aides, but he didn't answer right away. He wasn't done yet. Because exposing the network was only part of the work. The rest would be burning it down. The backlash came not as a wave, but as a slow, grinding tide, inevitable, corrosive, and loud in all the wrong ways. For every handwritten letter that arrived folded into envelopes lined with quiet gratitude, for every whispered thank you in a hallway or a nod exchanged across a courthouse corridor, there were 10 more voices casting him as a traitor to order. A man so consumed by personal vengeance he would tear down the walls that protected everyone else just to prove a point. The headlines were split, some calling him a hero, others calling him reckless, inflammatory, dangerous. On television panels and anonymous forums, they debated not the truth of what he exposed, but whether it should have been exposed at all. And Marcus, watching it unfold in real time, understood what few ever admit out loud. People are far more afraid of losing their illusions than they are of confronting injustice, and they will defend a lie that comforts them long after the truth has screamed itself hoarse. He didn't respond publicly. He didn't correct the narratives, didn't wade into comment sections or argue with half-informed radio hosts trying to turn his story into a soundbite. He stayed focused. The truth was already out there, and no amount of noise could stuff it back into silence. But the mayor's office, bowing to the pressure of optics and civil unrest, announced a town hall meeting. A chance, they claimed, to clear the air, though everyone in the city knew what it really was. An attempt to contain the narrative, to reframe Marcus not as a whistleblower, but as a complicated figure whose story had maybe gotten out of hand. The auditorium filled long before doors officially opened. Officers stood posted at the walls with arms folded and expressions unreadable, ordered not to interfere unless provoked. Reporters milled near the exits, their cameras already rolling, their microphones waiting for something volatile to catch. Marcus stood alone at the front of the stage, not behind a podium, not flanked by handlers, not wearing a uniform or a suit, just present, grounded, steady in the spotlight that burned down from above like an interrogation lamp, casting long shadows that felt far too familiar. JJ sat in the front row, eyes fixed on him, calm and coiled like a lawyer even when she wasn't working. Kara sat beside her, her notepad closed, the article already written in her mind, waiting only for its final beat. The crowd was restless, clapping in some corners, glaring in others, and in between them, a tense quiet that clung to the walls like static. He didn't lecture. He didn't defend. He simply told them what they needed to hear, not to win them over, but to remind them what had been allowed to grow in their blind spots. He spoke of Mercer and Hadley, not as monsters, but as products of a system that rewarded aggression and punished empathy. He spoke of the dogs, Django, Bravo, Rocket, not as victims alone, but as reflections of what happens when loyalty is warped into violence and trust is trained into silence. He laid out the chain of neglect, the falsified records, the evidence uncovered and verified and laid bare before the court. There was no performance in his voice, no swelling monologue or carefully planted applause lines. Just the truth, stripped of drama, anchored, in fact, delivered by a man who had nothing left to prove, but everything left to change. And yet, the tension didn't ease. The crowd still leaned forward with suspicion curled around their shoulders like smoke, waiting for something they could challenge, something they could boo, something that gave them permission to dismiss what they were hearing. But it never came. Instead, something else did. Near the end, after a long pause filled only by the subtle hum of overhead lights and the weight of unspoken questions, a boy no older than 8 stood slowly in the second row, climbing awkwardly onto his chair, as if he wasn't sure he had the right to speak, but couldn't leave without asking. His voice, when it came, was small, thin enough to crack the silence, but pure enough to hold it. "If they train the dogs to hate," he asked, his hands tight around the back of the chair in front of him, "can you train them to love again?" The room didn't shift. It stopped. There was no ripple of laughter, no uncomfortable coughs or shifting feet, just stillness. Marcus looked at him, not around the room, not toward the cameras, but directly at the boy, and lowered his body slightly so they could see each other without the distance that stage lights always try to create. He didn't answer immediately, didn't stall for effect, didn't explain. He just said the word. Yes? No applause followed, no cheers. But the stillness that held the room didn't break. It deepened. The truth of that single word, spoken without hesitation, without defense, without needing to be more than what it was, settled into the audience like a promise, one far more powerful than any court ruling or policy reform. Because for the first time, someone had answered without pretending the question was complicated. In Washington, the room was colder than Marcus expected. Not in temperature, but in tone, the kind of cold that came from sterile carpet, high ceilings, and polished wood furniture designed more for spectacle than comfort. The Federal Oversight Committee had convened under the title of Transparency. But Marcus had been in enough debriefings to know that most of what happened in rooms like this was theater. Still, this time, something was different. They weren't just letting him speak. They were listening. And not because they wanted a headline or a quote for the transcript, but because what he'd exposed couldn't be buried under protocol anymore. Too many people had seen the footage. Too many names were on record. And too many dogs, still alive but damaged, stood as evidence of a system that had prioritized control over conscience. He gave them the timeline, the testimony, the facts. But he didn't stop there. He gave them the structure, the layers of complicity that had made abuse possible not just in one precinct or one training unit, but across multiple states, through public contracts, private loopholes, and the silence of officials who signed off on paperwork they never read. He outlined the training distortions, the market trail for dogs rerouted to international security firms, and the way those animals were then re-exported as liabilities once their conditioning collapsed under pressure. He showed them how it started, with a leash, a voice, and a single wrong cue, and how it ended, in blood, in fear, in cages that held ghosts of loyalty turned violent through neglect. A week later, the committee's report was unanimous. Hadley and Mercer were sentenced with maximum penalties allowed under federal conspiracy statutes, their convictions strengthened by obstruction, falsified reports, and animal cruelty charges. The courtroom was packed that day, not just with journalists, but with people who had followed Marcus's journey from roadside victim to systemic truth-teller. When the sentences were read aloud, 37 years for Mercer, 32 for Hadley, no one cheered. The victory wasn't about punishment. It was about acknowledgement, the kind that couldn't be appealed. The investigation that followed cracked open what Marcus had only begun to uncover. Arrests spread across state lines. Trainers, contracting agents, former law enforcement supervisors, all swept into indictments linked by the same pattern. Dogs stolen from honorable service, turned into products, and discarded when they broke. And for the first time, federal reform didn't come in the form of recommendations. It came with teeth. Marcus declined press conferences. He ignored podcast invitations and high-profile interview requests. But when the letter came, signed by the new head of the Office of Canine Behavioral Standards, stamped with a formal offer, he accepted. Not because he needed the recognition, but because it was the only way to make sure the next generation of dogs never had to unlearn the violence taught to them in the name of order. He didn't take the job alone. The program's foundation was built not in a capital office or academic center, but in a rural facility outside Atlanta, an open-air space designed with quiet in mind, with sunlight, grass, and trails that had nothing to do with obedience drills. Former handlers came to retrain under his leadership, some of them Marcus's own former students, now returned to help rebuild what had been taken. And in time, the scars began to soften. Django and Bravo were part of the first wave. It didn't happen overnight. Their triggers were deep, buried under layers of mistrust and instinct, sharpened by fear. But Marcus worked with them the way he always had, with patience, precision, and language that didn't demand submission but offered partnership. Slowly, they began to respond, not out of habit, but because the space allowed them to remember who they had once been. 6 months later, footage surfaced of a community event in Macon. The camera panned across a wide green field, filled with local families, veterans, and their children. Marcus stood near the center, wearing his training vest, his expression steady but softened. Django sat beside him, tail low but relaxed, eyes tracking calmly. Bravo lay nearby, rolling slightly onto his side as a toddler approached with an open palm and no fear. Marcus gave a subtle nod. The dog responded with a soft, forward movement, pressing his nose gently to the child's hand before lying back down again. The crowd didn't erupt. There was no applause, just quiet awe. Because in a world so used to spectacle, sometimes the most radical thing you can show them is peace. Later that night, as the sun set over the fields and the crowd began to thin, Marcus stood at the edge of the enclosure and watched the dogs settle. Kara stood a few steps behind him, arms crossed, eyes thoughtful. She didn't speak at first. When she did, her voice was quiet. "You think it's enough?" she asked. "What you built?" Marcus didn't answer right away. He watched as Bravo leaned against Django, as two dogs who had once been trained to hurt, now rested with nothing to guard. "It's not about enough," he finally said. "It's about different." She nodded. "And somewhere, not in headlines, not in courtrooms, but here, in the dirt, in the stillness, in the space between old wounds and new work, the story ended. But the work began." The new training facility didn't announce itself with gates or guard towers, didn't flash credentials or press badges into passing hands. It stood quietly on the edge of a wooded ridge, shaped less like an institution and more like something grown from the land itself. A campus designed not for control, but for correction in the truest, most human sense of the word. Wide trails stretched across open fields where dogs moved freely beside their handlers. No leashes, no raised voices, only small gestures, body language tuned to the kind of trust that doesn't need to be commanded. Along the outer paths, new recruits walked slowly, learning not just how to give direction, but how to read intention, how to ask, not demand, how to guide without punishing, and most of all, how to listen. Marcus walked among them, not with the posture of an instructor, but with the quiet awareness of someone who had already fought the fire and was now focused on rebuilding from ash and memory. Every structure here, from the open kennels to the low-lit observation rooms to the padded training rings, had been designed with recovery in mind, not just for the animals, but for the people who had come through systems that taught them obedience mattered more than empathy, that loyalty was only useful if it was unthinking, and that control had to be absolute. Here, those ideas weren't challenged by protest. They were overwritten by example. Kara stood near the southern end of the field, camera steady against her shoulder, recording what would be the first of many graduation ceremonies, not staged for the press, but filmed as documentation. Proof that change wasn't a slogan or a speech, but something real, something hard-earned, something that took root slowly but deeply. She didn't narrate or script. She let the visuals breathe. Handlers walking side by side with rehabilitated dogs, issuing commands with clarity, not force, watching the animals respond not from fear, but from recognition and confidence, a rhythm that had once been lost, now fully reclaimed. Lena Brooks stood just behind the handler's table, her expression focused, clipboard held tight under one arm, as she nodded to each passing trainee, her badge newly engraved with her role as Director of Internal Compliance. No one here outranked her. She had been the one to expose the patterns that made the network possible, and now she ensured every system built in this place had limits, had logs, had accountability layered into every process, not as a show of control, but as a commitment to the kind of transparency that prevented old ghosts from taking root again. Her presence was quiet, but unshakable. Near the spectator ring, JJ watched the ceremony unfold from a shaded bench, her hair pulled back, her notes for the day tucked away in a folder she hadn't opened since the morning. Her firm had taken on a dozen new civil rights cases since the trial ended, each one connected to patterns uncovered during Marcus's investigation, cases involving excessive force, false alerts, racial bias disguised as procedure. And though her work had intensified, her presence here was not as an attorney. It was as a witness to something she had fought to make possible. She didn't smile often, but as Django trotted past, his posture relaxed and tail swaying low, she allowed herself one. At the far edge of the field, Marcus paused beside a young woman no older than 22, her uniform marked by the green armband of a first-year trainee, her eyes sharp with focus, but weighted by something more than nerves, something like purpose. The dog seated in front of her, a sable-coated shepherd named Lyra, sat without tension, her breath slow, her attention fully tuned to the figure beside her, waiting not for commands, but for intention. Marcus didn't raise his voice. He didn't pace. He simply stood, every inch of him calm and certain, and spoke to the gathered handlers not as a trainer, not as a survivor, but as someone who had earned the right to speak without apology. "You don't control a dog with fear," he said, his voice even, his eyes scanning the line of faces that had gathered not to be shaped into copies of the old system, but to learn how to lead something new. "You lead with trust." There were no whistles, no bursts of applause, just a line of dogs sitting quietly, unmuzzled, ears tilted toward the wind, still and steady beside the people they had come to know as partners rather than masters. Peace didn't need to be declared. It simply needed to be witnessed. And as the camera lens captured the final wide shot, handlers standing beside their dogs, sunlight breaking through the trees, the old scars no longer visible but no longer hidden. There was no need for narration, no need for summary. The story wasn't ending. It was beginning again, the right way. I hope you enjoyed that story. Please share it with your friends and subscribe so that you do not miss out on the next one. In the meantime, I have handpicked 2 stories for you that I think you will enjoy. Have a great day.